Good evening, everybody. Everybody watching us on YouTube. Welcome to Breaking the Bank, a national conversation on defunding the police, hosted here on The Breach. I'm going to say a little bit about this event. My name is Elle Jones. I'm joining you here tonight from Mi'kma'ki, Halifax, Kjipuktuk, the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Mi'kmaq people. And we are joined by activists and workers from across so-called Canada, from Halifax to so-called Vancouver. And the point of tonight's discussion is, as we enter budget season in all our municipalities, or perhaps have already experienced this, we wanted to talk together about what to do about the police budget, to share some strategies, to talk a bit about what is happening with policing in Canada, and start to organize nationally around how we can really speak back to these budgets that are increasing. For a little bit of background, in 2020, as we all know, we faced perhaps the largest mass movement in our contemporary history against the police, and that moment held a lot of promise for mobilizing. All of a sudden, we were having mainstream conversations about defunding and what was abolition, and people were pressing back on the police. And now here we are 2.5 years later, and rather than police being defunded or any of those things that we pushed for coming true, we have, of course, seen the opposite. Despite propaganda around increased crime and how the police have lost morale and can no longer police. In fact, all over Canada, we've seen the police not only get increased budgets, but continue to get more weapons, more technology, continue to be funded and upheld in all kinds of ways. And in fact, due to the backlash of 2020, we've seen a very effective movement to claim that, in fact, we need the police more than ever. So tonight, we're going to think through what is happening across the country in policing and look for some of the common threads, from the police interfering politically, such as running their own candidates or endorsing candidates, to the role of police unions, to how police boards fail at governance. We'll be looking at various issues from activists across the country who have been involved in their cities. And then we're going to have a second conversation where we speak together about what some of the strategies have been effective or what we can do as our boards and city councils approach the budget. Do we have any ideas of what to do to intervene in that? What are our goals? And do we see a way to combat the rise in police power and police budgets? So that's an overview of tonight. And to end, we will take Q&A. So if you are on the YouTube, feel free to put your questions into the chat. Obviously, we won't get to all of them, but we will end the night with question and answer. And we hope that those of you who are watching also continue to actively listen, to think about your own communities, and to really take away from this conversation what we can all do in a shared way to fight the police and to try and find ways to strategize against the budgets in our own cities. Of course, not every activist in the country is here. We are indebted to people like Robin Maynard, who is not here tonight, but this is not meant to be everybody who does defunding. It's a sample of people from across the country. So we encourage people to continue having this conversation and organizing together. We know there's much work that we won't cover tonight in many cities, but this is a snapshot conversation that we hope is part of a larger conversation. So with that said, we're going to begin by moving across the country, not in any kind of order, and hearing from the people that we have today on what is going on in their city, what they think pressing issues are in police, and their own take on what is happening with policing in Canada. So the first person I'm going to ask to speak is Desmond Cole, who is in Toronto. Desmond Cole is an activist, the author of the best-selling book, The Skin We're In, which is now in paperback and contains updates. So people should certainly, even if you have the hardcover, that does not mean you've seen everything in that book. So please do buy the paperback. And Desmond, of course, was recently involved in advocacy against the police budget increase in Toronto, where the police were awarded the money that they asked for. So Desmond, I'm inviting you to speak. And go
ahead. Thanks, Elle. And thank you for organizing for all of us to be here. And thank you to The Breach for hosting and broadcasting this as well. Okay. It's true, Elle, what you said, that the proposed increase by our our police board of $50 million, which is the equivalent of about 200 new police officers in Toronto, did pass the police board this week. It has to continue through to our actual entire city council, so it's not a done deal yet. But if anybody's been paying attention to Toronto City Council over many years, it certainly feels like it's a done deal. It is a tough time here, obviously, as it is in many places. This budget isn't a new emergence. It's the continuation of a set of conditions that we've been dealing with for a long time. Our administration here in Toronto under John Tory have also proposed recently to add 50 new special constables, as they're called, to the Toronto Transit system. This is as the fares for the system go up and service levels are proposed to decline. So we're being told that the budget is for less service for more money in Toronto now, but also the further criminalization of transit spaces and the further policing, which we know results, of course, in dire consequences, just as the Toronto Police's actions do. We've also, of course, seen the continued criminalization of homeless people, unhoused people in our city, the shutting of several temporary shelter spaces that were used to temporarily and very inadequately house unhoused people. So it's not that those interventions were the greatest, but some of those shelter hotels in Toronto are now slated to be shut completely, which will further decrease the capacity. And just this week, we saw another example of, the Toronto Police telling us they have no staffing, but they can send, 15 officers to go dismantle a tent that has been up for years in downtown Toronto. They brought a heavy machinery, a claw, to come as well to do this work, while they say that they don't have enough resources. We added more than 20 names to the homeless memorial in Toronto this week. That is unhoused people, many of them unidentified, who were killed or who died due to their circumstances of not being supported. It's a grim time. It's been a grim time. It continues to get worse. And I think what we're seeing right now is a kind of pivoting by our administration under John Tory to really say people are asleep, people are not paying attention. It's time to really go full press on some of the harsher things that we would like to do and the messaging behind that. There has been resistance. There always is. We've seen a lot of people mobilizing to, speak at the recent police board meeting, to contact their local politicians. These things are important. And even when they happen, in modest numbers, it's still a demonstration for me how people are following along and are concerned and are willing to do something about their concern over what's happening. For me, the real question is, what is it that we're all willing to do? And how do we organize around what we're the most forceful things that we're willing to do in order to stop this tyranny? Because speaking at budget committee, police board, which I did, for example, this week, it doesn't stop police from voting, doesn't stop the police board and the politicians from voting on the things that the police want. It doesn't disrupt their agenda sufficiently. What does that is mass mobilization, is people getting out into the streets, is people being disruptive, is of a much broader movement to, express dissent and be willing to demonstrate a willingness to take action behind that dissent. And this is the trouble that we have, is that we're constantly mobilizing for the next emergency, I suppose. And we don't have numbers. There aren't thousands of people in Toronto who, despite being willing to write a letter, despite being willing to give a deputation, there aren't thousands of people who are ready to go into the streets tomorrow and stop traffic, which is perhaps what's needed in order for this, latest assault on us to be stopped or even mitigated somewhat. So just in the couple of minutes that I have left, I won't be joining the larger conversation this evening. I have to leave, and I apologize for that. But I think that the question for us is, how do we build that bigger movement? We're always talking about that. There's an event happening here in Toronto on Saturday where the family members and some people directly themselves who have been directly influenced by police violence are having a dinner, they're hosting it, and then they're going to be speaking out about their circumstances and their fight back. I think it's really important to do that and to center the voices and the experiences of the people who are being the most directly targeted and affected by this violence. We all are in many ways, but people who have lost children, people who have been disabled by the police, people who have been jailed, they need to be able to speak, and we need to support them in doing that. But I think, like, if I can end on something somewhat optimistic, the momentum that I'm seeing, the expressions of outrage and of shock at what's happening in Toronto right now, it's occurring in a way that hasn't been for a little while, because I think post Rob Ford, John Tory has been able to lull this city to sleep. And that a lot of the political energy, as Elle had mentioned from 2 years ago, has dissipated. So I just think that it is in doing a lot of the basic things, in gathering together, feeding each other, taking care of one another, listening to each other, and always trying to say, so what's the next thing that we can do? Who else can we invite who isn't here today? I'm noticing acutely in Toronto that people who have been fighting against the police for years are exhausted, are burnt out, are not able to be in the fight. And it's because too much is being asked of them to carry a load that individuals can't carry. So I'm going to stop by saying, I hope that we're all able to carry forward the momentum. It is really beautiful to see people like Claudette Beals-Clayton, the mother of Regis Korchinski-Paquette, organizing this event for Saturday. Chantel Moore's mother is going to be there from New Brunswick. People are going to be there from Ottawa and different places. I hope that a big part of the future of our organizing and our strengthening and growing centers people like that, who have paid such a price at the hands of the police and who are still somehow out here fighting for a better day. So I'll leave it there for now and say thank you very much, Elle.
Thank you, Desmond. And as Desmond mentioned, he does have to leave the conversation, but he leaves us in this moment with a word of hope as well, that, we're often caused under neoliberalism to believe that there's no way out and that we can't win. And I think as we move forward through the night and through our activism, we can and do win, even if those gains are small and not apparent in the moment. So that's a really important note to strike. Thank you, Desmond. I'm going to go next to Leon Laidlaw, who is with Winnipeg Police Cause Harm, and he's a professor in the criminology department at Carleton University. And for those who don't know the work of Winnipeg Police Cause Harm, you can follow them on Twitter. They're always giving us updates and really staying on the neck of the Winnipeg police. So thank you, Leon.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Elle, and thank you again for inviting WPCH, Winnipeg Police Cause Harm. I'm super glad to be here speaking on behalf of the group alongside such brilliant and inspiring people. So thank you to the organizers, to the Breach, and everyone behind the scenes making this talk possible. So tonight, I want to discuss two things that relate to topics of policing and budgets. And the first relates to the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people in the local context, and as well as Winnipeg being the host of the World Police and Fire Games in 2022. So in early December of 2022, news aired of a serial killer being charged for the murder of 4 Indigenous women in Winnipeg: Rebecca Contois, Morgan Harris, Mercedes Myron, and Buffalo Woman. Rebecca Contois' body was found last summer in a city landfill, and since June, the Winnipeg Police Service has suspected that the body of Morgan Harris and possibly others would also be found there. However, the Winnipeg Police Chief, Danny Smythe, was quick to declare that the police would not be searching the landfills for these women's remains, and his decision, of course, exists as part of this purposeful and systemic disregard for Indigenous lives. It was Bear Clan Patrol, not police, who held a search in early May for Morgan Harris, soon after she disappeared. Morgan's daughter, Cambria Harris, has been central to organizing for the search. A blockade and sacred fire at the Brady landfill is ongoing, which is named Camp Morgan Harris, and which is led by First Nations Indigenous warriors. So while the fire continues, the city just resumed regular operations on site. News released this week states that the camp cost the city $400,000 extra on waste collection. In reality, the city brought this on itself by failing to act. It would have cost the city only a fraction of this cost to actually start the search in June, and the blockade only exists because of the city's negligence. The fact that family survivors are being constructed as disruptive protesters who are wasting cities' resources is thinly veiled racism, all while the WPS, Winnipeg Police Service, sits on a constantly inflating budget of $324 million last year, yet somehow can never find the resources or use the resources to do this search. It has always been community who is keeping us safe and who are doing the work to bring our sisters home. WPCH issued a call for Indigenous self-determination over the search, with all funding and decisions in the hands of community, not in the hands of colonial governments or police. We, alongside other grassroots group on Treaty 1, continue to support Camp Morgan Harris in the ways that we can, for instance, through firewood donations to keep the sacred fire burning. Currently, Red River Echoes, a grassroots group premised on Métis resurgence in Manitoba, is doing a raffle and fundraiser to support the camp, and I invite folks to consider supporting them. All while we have this ongoing crisis of gendered colonial violence, the City of Winnipeg is currently spending its resources on hosting the World Police and Fire Games. The World Police and Fire Games is a 10-day event scheduled to be hosted in Winnipeg this July, early August. We see this as a gross glorification of state violence and a shameful waste of police resources, or public resources, sorry. Police Chief Danny Smythe again claimed that this will be the largest sporting event ever hosted in the province of Manitoba, with 8,500 police, firefighters, customs officers, prison guards, and other carceral agents expected to be in attendance. So first, obviously, this is a dangerous conflation of state violence and militancy with sports, considering that these so-called games also involve 5 different gun events. But also this constitutes a huge carceral takeover of the city, with 60 events being scheduled in public spaces across the city over these 10 days. We see them promoting the event with bumper stickers being pasted on our city's fire trucks and police cruisers and a huge banner displayed in central downtown. This is propaganda, of course, at its finest. So in addition to these very real dangers associated with carceral agents infiltrating the city, the games are a disgusting waste of public money. The event is expected to cost the city $17 million, which is spent on subsidizing office rentals and hotel costs, and the province and the federal government has also spent millions in support. Yet this public cost is somehow downplayed by proposing that this event is going to have a great economic impact. However, this economic impact is really going to private corporations, restaurants, hotels, bars, attractions, with little to no trickle down for service workers, let alone the rest of us. So these games are being hosted in downtown Winnipeg, where the effects of state violence, colonialism, racial capitalism are strikingly visible. While the city is investing in a vacation and party for carceral agents, we have the context in which people are going missing and murdered in our city. People are living in camps along the Red River shores, and we have an ongoing crisis of overdose deaths by opioids. And this is where precisely our money should be going. So WPCH is committed to organizing against these games, and I would love to actually strike up a conversation later about how we can mobilize on a national scale to incite outrage and cancel these games. The last comment that I want to make is that there is so much support and so much public interest in defunding the police. And we know, since we have seen this in 2020 and beyond, WPCH also launched a healthy community survey where they invited the community members to provide their thoughts on police budgets. This was launched last year. Of our participants, 1/4 of people wanted to see an initial 50% cut to the police budget for 2022-2023. And 70% of all respondents wanted to see some sort of funding reduction, and done so until the WPS was completely defunded. 70% want the defunding to the total abolition of the WPS. Our communities wanted this money instead redirected to public housing, safe consumption sites and supply, non-carceral crisis response, and affordable and accessible public transportation. In this context, we know defunding is of public interest. And that's where I'm going to leave it off for today. I have so much more I would be happy to share, but I thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you so much, Leon. I don't think many of us knew about this horrific games taking place, so thank you for sharing that with us. And I'll also point out the conflation of policing with fire, right? So the way that the police have wormed themselves into being seen as first responders rather than carceral agents. So thank you for that. And we will continue that discussion. Next up, I'm going to ask Ted Rutland. Ted is an associate professor at Concordia University and the author of Displacing Blackness, Planning, Power, and Race in 20th Century Halifax, which is probably behind me on the shelf. You might be able to see it. It might be on this shelf somewhere. So welcome, Ted, and take it away.
I'm coming to you from Tiohtià:ke, occupied Mohawk, Haudenosaunee, and Algonquin territory, known colonially as Montreal. And I want to just talk a little bit about some of the organizing that's happened here since 2020 and what happened in response. And so in June 2020, when these historic protests were filling the streets in the United States and in Canada, a group of organizers who had already been organizing within an abolitionist lens came together to form the Defund the Police Coalition. And the coalition was formed under the leadership of three really amazing organizers, Marlene Lopez, Sandra Wesley, and Jessica Chiano. And the coalition very quickly attracted 80 member groups, identified 10 demands to organize around, the most important of which being cutting the police budget by 50% and reallocating that to a bunch of services that we identified. And did a bunch of organizing work, a bunch of projects in the first year. And so I want to name a couple of things that the coalition has been doing, just some of the most important things. And so the first is just organizing protests, particularly in the first year. There were many protests, some of them downtown and really big, some of them smaller, just occupying an intersection. Really lively, vibrant protests that I think captured the energy of the moment, got a lot of media attention, and kept the idea of defunding the police in the public discussion. Secondly, we developed an alternative city budget. And so it's about a 60-page document outlining specifically where we want the 50% of the police budget removed, like what do we want cut specifically, and what specifically do we want that money reallocated to, which I think has been really important because, you know, as many people will observe, I think one of the criticisms that's made of the Defund the Police movement is that we know what you're against, but we don't know what you're for. Or they say, you know, we can't just fire a bunch of cops. There's real problems in our city. So the budget helps to articulate that, you know, we are talking reducing the size of the police force massively, but we're not just doing that. We're talking about putting in place other kinds of things that will really keep each other safe, that will uplift people's well-being. Third, we organized, that happened this past fall, the Defund la Police Festival, a day-long festival of workshops, art, music in a park in West Side Montreal, which we saw as an effort to kind of recharge the movement in 2022 as people's energies were getting dissipated and as maybe some people's interest in this struggle had waned. We wanted to get people together in a festive environment to upgrade ourselves, upgrade our knowledge of funding the police, make new friendships, build new relationships, and get people involved in the struggle. And then finally, we have a committee called École Sans Police, which is doing really, really long-term, slow grassroots organizing to get police out of schools. And so really organizing with students, parents, and teachers to try to build power to have police removed from schools. What has that resulted in? A bunch of things. And so one of the things we can point to is that in the fall of 2020, the city released a survey about the city's budget, the city residents' budget priorities. And they included a question about police funding. And in response to that survey, 73% of Montrealers said they wanted to see the police budget cut. So a huge level of support. I don't actually think the public support is at that level. It's an online survey, so it's probably exaggerating the extent to which people support defunding the police, but it's a strong level of support. Unfortunately, what we've seen is not defunding the police. We've seen continual budget increases for 2021, for 2022, and for 2023. And in fact, Montreal has increased its police budget more than any other city in Canada since 2020. So in terms of practically achieving our objectives, it's been not a very successful period. But I want to sort of identify a couple of the reasons that that's been really difficult to achieve that kind of progress. Am I still there? I want to identify two really important reasons that we've struggled, which may be relevant to struggles in other cities as well. So the first is that the Montreal Police and the Police Brotherhood reacted very strategically and very effectively to defund the police movement. They were already seeking to push back against resistance to racial profiling prior to 2020 by stoking fears about gun violence, which they called gun violence initially, and then they started to do what they would expect them to do, which is calling it gang violence. And I think in Toronto and Montreal, gang is a synonym for black. And so they managed to really fill the media with stories about what they call gun violence. But what we actually see is many times a week stories about gunshots in a neighborhood, no suspect, no victim, in which stokes the idea that there's a real gun violence problem and that we need more police and more police funding to stop it, which of course is, ridiculous. The defund the police movement isn't a movement saying we should just fire a bunch of cops and nothing else, or that there's no problems in our cities, that there's no harms. It's about a different way of responding to the harms, the very real harms that exist in all of our communities. So they were very successful with that. And then the second thing is Montreal and Vancouver, I think, are the only large cities in Canada that have a party system. We have political parties at the municipal level. And we are in the unfortunate position in Montreal that we have a centrist party called Projet Montréal that has some progressive policies and some right-wing policies, but their only competitor is a right-wing party. And so they basically squatted the political spectrum from sort of center to progressive. They've strangled the voices of the few progressive people that exist within the party. So I think Montreal is kind of unique in that we don't have a single city councillor who's speaking in favor of defunding the police, even though there are some who are, but they're they're not entitled to speak publicly about this. And so, they've managed to occupy a part of the political spectrum that would normally be occupied by actual progressive people. And they have the power. They've got the majority of the seats in city council. So they've been managing to implement, I think, the most right-wing police agenda in Canada to no opposition within the political spectrum itself. So I'll conclude there. I think there are some promising things that have happened, which I'll talk about, I think, maybe in the discussion later on.
Thank you, Ted. And I do want to say that you jumped a little bit, so I don't know if you want to try and come back in before the discussion. You were a little breaking up as you were speaking. We did get what you said, but maybe if you want to try and re-enter, I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Maybe you can't get back in. Anyway, and I do want to also apologize on the accessibility front. We do not have captioning available in StreamYard. We apologize for that. Obviously, disability and policing very much crosses, carcerality and disability cross. So that is our fault for not providing an accessible environment. Next time we do this, we will make sure to do better. So I apologize for that. I understand that may have made this event inaccessible for people, so our apologies. I do want to now introduce Meenakshi Mano. Meenakshi is a criminalization and policing campaigner at Pivot Legal Society and a member of the Vancouver Prison Justice Day Committee and Defund 604 Network, and an all-around boss. So welcome, Meenakshi.
Damn, I can't believe Elle just called me a boss. I'm very honored. And yeah, I appreciate following Ted's remarks. I feel like everyone's now vying for which police force is most fascist. And maybe that'll come through in the discussion. So I wanted to start by situating Vancouver's position kind of within the most recent trajectory of calls to defund the Vancouver Police Department, VPD. And I'd say the last 4 years are kind of like a continuous struggle that's been really iterative. So from 2019, the call first emerged within the downtown east side. So I'm sure folks kind of have heard of this neighborhood that's been so used in a narrative around policing, criminalization, and stigma. But beyond 2019, and ever since settlers descended on this unceded, unsurrendered, sovereign Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory, there has been opposition to policing, built by Indigenous folks challenging the way that they've been targeted by police through violence in the criminal legal system, violence against the local Asian diaspora, starting in white supremacist riots at the turn of the century. The local police's longstanding indifference and, frankly, active accomplice in cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit folks, their anti-Black racism, their targeting of sex workers, and I could go on and on and on. The Downtown East Side, which is also a community that I work within, has been recognized as a hotspot of police violence, including instances of fatal police intervention. Most recently in August 2022, when Chris Amiot was killed by the VPD. He was naked in the street. He was in obvious distress, apparently from being bear sprayed, and he was searching out milk to ease his pain, which folks sometimes do when they get bear sprayed, try to relieve the pain in their eyes. Use baby soap if that happens to you. Anyways, when police officers descended on that scene, they employed lethal baton rounds against Chris. He died on site. And shockingly, Chris is not even the first person in distress. He's not even the first naked person to be gunned down in the street by the VPD, and his death bears a chilling similarity to the killing of Chester, which occurred just a few blocks away in January 2021. So this is the police force that we are funding. And of course, for years, the VPD has held itself out as a progressive force, one that supports treating substance use as a public health issue, one that recognizes mental health isn't a criminal issue, and a force whose chief, Adam Palmer, claims that there's no systemic racism within the ranks of. This force receives $1 million in funding per day, and in 2023, they've made a submission for an operating budget of $383 million and change to the city. The city itself has come back with a proposal of $361 million, which aligns with a 5% cap on property tax increases that's been mandated by council. It's kind of an interesting moment because even within neoliberal capitalist logic, now the police budget is putting it at odds with the interests of home and property owners, again, on unceded Indigenous land, who want to maximize the profit that they can extract from their stolen assets. And in Vancouver, we have absolutely no reason to anticipate a successful challenge of this police budget. Mayor Ken Sim and the ABC Majority Council are backed by the police. They had a widely touted endorsement by the Vancouver Police Union. And we've already seen members of ABC advance the VPD agenda through the school board, where their first order of business wasn't dealing with an elected member who was identified as an ineligible individual by CRA. They had a motion to return cops to schools, despite organizing led by Black and Indigenous families and students who saw no need for armed, uniformed, or any kind of cop in schools. And I think that the ABC template is something that organizers in other cities really need to be aware of. It's a slickly branded party. You can see I'm wearing their logo today. It's backed by local alt-right millionaires like Chip Wilson from Lululemon and the Pacific Prosperity Network. And they've really coasted in on the most asinine and superficial type of identity politics. We celebrated our first mayor of color, despite his endorsement and installation, really, by the wealthy and powerful cops and capitalists. My colleague at Pivot, Tanya Aganaba, often remarks that this is elite capture at work. It's also incredibly effective because of the dollars behind it. And ABC kind of ran on a BIPOC, LGBTQ inclusion campaign in an attempt to distinguish themselves from other more open fascists, but they also benefited from those folks. There was a kind of anti-downtown east side hate campaign that ran parallel to our last municipal election in the fall of 2020, supported both by Chip Wilson and his friends like Adam Zivo, Pierre Poilievre, Adam Palmer, Tom Stamatakis, and Ralph Kaisers. And this summer, there was a horrific documentary that came out called Vancouver is Dying, just anti-downtown east side propaganda. And essentially, people just want to disappear the downtown east side in service of aggressive gentrification, urban renewal, and the detention of all undesirable elements. And I do want to note that progressive folks like the BC NDP also more or less condone this through their policymaking that fails to protect folks' rights and dignity. But I know I've got very limited time, but I do want to say that the election of ABC has just kind of made concrete an anti-homeless, anti-poor politic that is sadly shared by many folks in Vancouver across whatever identities you want to name. It's a very effective tool that makes people blame the most disenfranchised folks in our neighborhoods for every form of structural oppression. But really, the folks who face street sweeps aren't the reason that a business can't afford a triple net lease. They're not the reason that an average one-bedroom apartment in Vancouver is $2,500 a month, but blaming them is common sense for people who profit from inequality, and it's good business, especially for the police who can swoop in with their benevolent care. I'm really looking forward to talking about tactic because ABC is a majority on every type of municipal government here, council, parks board, and school board, demands a shift in tactics. And I think it's an exciting shift that also pushes us away from believing in colonial power, including city government, including social planning, including fixing it from the inside. We can really look now to creative and sustainable interventions that don't make us beg for change from people who clearly don't give a damn.
Thank you, Meenakshi. And your shirt is fire. I'm loving the shirt. I tried to put Ted's book up on the back, but I realized my frame doesn't have it. Beside my book, there's Ted's book. All right. And thank you to everybody in the chat. There's some really great comments, people comparing the police budget to the militarization of society, talking about cops in school. So we encourage you to continue using that chat because we are reading what you're saying, and it's a really great contribution to the conversation. We have two more speakers left. Next up is Tari Ajadi. Tari is a PhD candidate at Dalhousie in political studies. He was a co-author on our report, Defunding the Police, Defining the Way Forward for HRM, which laid out a roadmap on defunding for our city. Spoiler, they did not defund. And is also teaching at McGill University. Welcome, Tari.
Thank you so much, Elle. And thank you so much to The Breach and to everyone who's spoken before and just everyone who's here on the stream. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight, despite the fact that policing is not a pleasurable thing that exists in our society. So I'm joining you from Tiohtià:ke, also colonially known as Montreal, but I've spent many years in Kjipuktuk in Mi'kma'ki, colonially known as Halifax. And today I'll be speaking about Halifax, a place that I love and I miss dearly. I'm going to be speaking in part as a board member of the East Coast Prison Justice Society, a co-founder alongside Elle, and alongside folks like Harry Critchley, Martha Painter, Jen Taylor, and others of the Nova Scotia Policing Policy Working Group, and also a co-author of the Defunding the Police, Defining the Way Forward for HRM report that Elle mentioned, alongside Harry Critchley, Elle, of course, and Julia Rogers. So, just like in many other cities across Canada, there's been a protracted fight in Halifax over the police budget for the past couple of years. The fight really started with a presentation that Elle made at the police board. People weren't generally at the time presenting at the police board. They weren't, the Board of Police Commissioners has existed for decades, but it's been this completely inert body, really used to just kind of like sign off on various forms of state harm and state violence. But Elle went to the police board and said, listen, if you're not going to implement recommendations from the Wortley report, which was a report authored by Scott Wortley about street checks in Halifax, then you should not be increasing the police budget. So this meeting or this presentation happened in January of 2020. Shortly after, of course, the pandemic hit, and then, of course, George Floyd, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, Chantel Moore, and many others were murdered at the hands of police officers. And so, you know, in Halifax, what this prompted was the reversal of the purchase of an armored vehicle, which was worth about $400,000. And so community members mobilized to stop this armored vehicle from being purchased by the regional council. And so that process emboldened people to be able to speak univocally against police harm and police violence. And in the process, we formed the Nova Scotia Policing Policy Working Group. And our goal was really to try and develop, I guess, a bit of a robust infrastructure around this organizing to try and maintain momentum in a manner similar to what Ted was talking about a bit earlier in Montreal. And so we did a number of things. Firstly, just intervening at the police board procedurally, which was quite interesting, right? Like they hadn't even questioned the idea that perhaps the ways that they were doing things were somehow flawed or an issue or didn't make any sense. And we intervened in that way, and that actually opened up the opportunity for us to develop the defunding report. But we also developed a survey during the municipal elections that were held in 2020. And one of the things that we did that was most important was that we connected a group or groups of people within the city to be able to become a part of the subcommittee to define defunding the police. And the work of the subcommittee ultimately produced the Defunding the Police report. That had 36 recommendations. It was a roadmap, as Elle mentioned, towards defunding in Halifax. We asked 2,400 residents what they thought about defunding. We asked them what they imagined in terms of what they would like to see, the services they would like to have. We focused on everything from traffic calming and street lights, all the way to participatory budgeting, all the way to investigating use of force, getting rid of lethal weapons. We can kind of go down through the whole list. I'm not going to bore you by going through a 218-page report, but suffice it to say, it's pretty robust. Last year, we held also our first ever public consultation on the police budget in Halifax, and many community members showed up, and again, they spoke pretty much uniformly with one voice except for one person, to say, no, there should not be a budgetary increase. And so I say all of this, I give this kind of broad architecture of our process to identify that there were some wins. And it's important when we're talking about the cascading harms that come with doing policing work and the exhaustion that comes as part of this process, to recognize that there were some important wins. We held the police to a budgetary increase of 0.4%, despite the fact that they asked for 2%, which, you know, ultimately is still an increase, but it wasn't as bad as we hoped. We diverted and largely halted a massive expansion of body cameras in the municipality, with the exception of the RCMP. We helped to launch a sobering centers project in the municipality, and there's momentum towards civilian mental health crisis response at every turn. And these are important wins because the community fought for them. But at the same time, there is this fundamental reality here. The system's rigged. It's set up for the cops to win. Last year, they hired 14 new sworn officers. This year, they're going to ask for 3 sworn officers and 2 civilians. They're not being held accountable for the violence that they repeatedly unleash on community members, particularly unhoused community members. And most of all, it's a system of civilian governance that helps them to win, right? And that's something that's really problematic. And I don't have much time here, but the way that I conceive of it is a Mendoza line, perhaps, between incompetence and malevolence, right? You never know where things are going to fall. Is this happening because someone doesn't know any better? Or is this happening because someone does know better and they're doing their best to make your life as difficult as possible? Right. And I think that that process is something that I'm happy to talk about more. I'm happy to talk about some of the strategies we've used and the interventions in governance that we've made during this process. So I'll leave my comments there, and I'm excited to get into the conversation.
Thank you so much, Tari. We're coming to the last speaker, so I do want to remind people of what will happen next. We're going to have an informal conversation amongst ourselves, and also those in the chat can put things in around what we think some effective organizing strategies are, what has worked for us, what didn't work. I know that as usual, we set a time and we never hit that time. So we are going to try and, we're not going to make it at, in 15 minutes. So we'll try and keep this down so that we're not going above too much time. So that'll be about a 15-minute discussion. And then we'll do a short Q&A just so that people know where we are. But now I'd like to ask our last speaker. Hafsa Mohammed is an anti-colonial abolitionist in Sikunik, Moncton, a student of political economy, and an organizer with Grassroots New Brunswick. So welcome, Hafsa.
Thank you, Elle. As Elle described, I'm living in Sikunik, the ancient and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, currently occupied by the colony of Moncton. I often joke about the reason I live in the settler province of New Brunswick is because I am a student of Canadian colonialism, and this province is the heart of it. But there is truth in that, as we are the poorest province in the settler nation, who also happens to have the largest oil refinery in the country, owned by Irving Oil. The Irving family is the 5th largest landowner in the United States and the 13th largest landowner globally. The Irving family of companies owns enough of the vertical and horizontal supply chains in New Brunswick to control taxation, prevent the regulation of the carcinogenic pesticides they use on the land they stole, and own most of the English media in the province and have a history of exercising their editorial control in their papers. The natural resources of the area are being furiously extracted and exploited by these handful of billionaires, while Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey nations race to protect the territories they steward. To make matters worse, the province violently expanded international immigration in the last few years. So we are simultaneously witnessing the settler colonial state organize its racial capitalist political economy, all for the benefit of land-grabbing settlers. Abolitionists in New Brunswick are resisting the police forces that protect these dynasties' stolen capital, and there's a lot of capital on the line. So that sets the stage for the settler colony of Moncton, once the headquarters for the Intercolonial Railway in the late 19th century. Grassroots NB and other abolitionist organizations have done several actions over the last several years to call for police reallocation. However, I will focus on one case study, our most recent action, to describe both the socio-political landscape of a small settler city and to highlight some of the mechanics of this struggle. In the spring of 2022, Moncton had a bunch of NIMBYs host a series of town halls to complain about how they don't feel safe anymore. These settlers had the full-fledged support of all levels of government, the private sector, and the nonprofit industrial complex, who platformed the notion that street-involved, unhoused people are causing crime. I watched how the state and its affiliates, who understand houselessness, drug use, poverty, and the effects of trauma, literally rile up hundreds of people, all from a specific socioeconomic background, that is, middle-class white cis settlers, at these town halls. They didn't use that opportunity to educate the public on the issue, but rather exploited it to justify expanding the police in their upcoming budgets. And so abolitionists from all over Atlantic Canada came together to educate and survey the public. It turns out there is also a large and growing segment of the settler population that wants to reallocate police funding. Defunding the police fits squarely in the frameworks of technocracy, which colonial societies love to tout as their organizing principles. I would even say technocracy is the ideological framework that settlers use to rationalize their subscription to this state. So a bunch of ordinary people in our community came together to organize town halls and educate sessions on reallocating police funding and presented hard-hitting science and public opinion to offset the harms from the original town halls and to express our solidarity with poor and oppressed people. Not surprisingly, the state, the nonprofit industrial complex, and the police refused our invitations to these sessions. However, we did hear from people from many different political and professional backgrounds call for reallocation, because even mainstream colonial science clearly states that it just makes sense to seriously detask this institution, this violent institution. Even centrists recognize that abolition is the first step, not to austerity or anarchy, but for transforming harm. When state subscribers witness their governments ignore the mountain of empirical evidence that care over criminalization is more effective and efficient by every metric, including cost, and when state subscribers witness their governments ignore evidence that funding supports would make stronger societies they represent, make stronger the societies they represent, and witness instead their representation, their elected representation, continue to invest huge portions of public budgets in unscientific ways. This leaves the public confused and starting to ask questions about whose interests the governments serve. Despite all the evidence we presented in our municipal government, and despite the significant public interest in reallocating funding, the municipal executive offered to give the RCMP more money than they requested. When city councillors asked the RCMP superintendent if 5 more police officers and $6 million more will reduce crime, he answered honestly and said no. I've witnessed the superintendent lie openly before. I don't believe he told the truth because he was just so honest he would even put his institution's funding on the line by telling the truth. It makes me ask, whose solidarity do you have to be so honest and know that your institution of violence will not be harmed? It's also interesting to note how the municipal council, no matter what they say in public debate, will always vote in favor of the industry. Though there was enough public pressure for defunding the police in Moncton that after councillors voted for more police funding, some of them did an apology tour on French CBC. From a political economy perspective, New Brunswick has monopoly industrialists like the Irvings literally speak to the media, urging New Brunswickers to, for example, integrate newcomers who leave this province because living here as an immigrant is insufferable. Industrialists occasionally publicly take a stance on public policy because owners of capital benefit from policy going a certain way. In this case, telling New Brunswickers that their personal racism is affecting the owning class's ability to benefit from systemic and economic racism. If retaining immigrants in the province impacts the Irvings enough to tell the public to go on public record, to tell the public to be less racist, how would transformative justice affect the bottom line? If billionaire industrialists know that public policy affects the economy, why are they silent on defunding the police? And how are police so confident they're not going to be defunded? And why are municipal executives so uncomfortable with spending nearly 20% of their entire budgets on an institution that makes poverty worse and makes their job harder? Why are governments willfully ignoring conclusive data if good government is their only objective? And why are nonprofit social and health services telling advocates that if they called for transformative justice, their organization would lose their funding? And I'll talk about next steps in the next section.
Thank you so much, Hafsa, and thank you for closing us with that fire talk. All right, so I'm going to just prompt us a little bit moving into discussion, but for those who are discussing and including in the chat, just feel free to jump in as you wish and talk amongst yourself and keep this informal. We don't have to be rigid. We've heard some of the trends we've heard, so the shared patterns across the country. So we're seeing many of the same narratives and tactics being used across this country, which may help us in sharing ways to combat those things, or if something is experienced in one city, we're likely to experience in another. So one thing we're hearing is that there are patterns, there are tactics being used. We're also hearing a lot about the myths of policing that get installed publicly. So despite the fact that evidence shows that increasing police does not reduce crime, that it is not effective, that it is costly, the police very effectively control a public narrative around crime and fear. So we're seeing that across the country. We're also seeing, and especially in the chat, people are pointing out how policing exists in multiple sites. So fighting the police does not just mean fighting, the boys in blue on the street. It is also fighting carcerality in many different sites. So including in schools, borders, we're hearing about the military and the connection to the police as well. So also thinking about the ways what are they called? Police fire games, where, you have all of these different organizations that involve themselves in carcerality. So thinking about the many sites of policing, and then also, of course, the rooting of policing and other forms of violence and oppression, including violence against Indigenous, trans, two-spirited, queer women and girls as well. The involvement of policing and racist colonial violence. So we've heard some of those trends from across the country. So I don't know if you want me to launch into a question or if someone wants to speak, but I guess I'll start us off and then you guys can all jump from there. And since I'm familiar with this work, I'm going to go to Tari first. So Tari, perhaps what I was thinking about too is that you spoke about many of the interventions, some successful, some less successful, that we undertook. And I suppose one of the questions that people may have is, what is the point? So is there a point to going to the police board? Is there a point to trying to get somebody on your local police board? Or is there a point of doing a delegation to council when it seems that the police inevitably get the money anyway? So could you maybe speak about what is the value in some of these interventions, even if they may not be successful in the short term, and what you see as some of the tactics we can use against that? If that's not a huge question. Go ahead, Tari.
Oh, no, thanks, Al. I appreciate the question because it's something I think about all the time, right? And, you know, I mentioned when I was talking earlier that Mendoza line, the incompetence, malevolence kind of like threshold here. And I think that to be glib, the point is to interrupt that, right? Like the point is to demonstrate that, no, in fact, we are the people with the evidence and we are the people with moral certitude, right, in this process, right? We are the people that are reflecting and meaningfully engaging with community voice, and we are the people that are combating violence and harm that is being done unto us. We can speak for ourselves. So that's a very kind of glib response, but I think it's important within the context of police governance, because as I was mentioning earlier, this is the kind of facilitating mechanism that helps to give the rubber stamp, perhaps, of this kind of democratic impulse, right? Like in the kind of like absurd and often pretend logic that we live in a kind of democratic society where we're supposed to be represented by individuals that have our best interest in heart, right? Like this is part of our police act, right? These are the policies that govern the ways that the police are ostensibly supposed to be run. It's really important that we are able to demonstrate quite clearly that what they are doing is not in our best interest and is not with our consent, right? And so when we do, for example, get someone on the police board, and here I'm going to shout out Harry Critchley, who's been just like holding it down and doing incredible work, oftentimes thankless work on the Halifax Police Board to try in whatever way possible to hold them to account in some way, shape, or form. That there's a meaning to that. There's a meaning in demonstrating that, hey, not in our name, this does not work. And last year, it actually made a significant difference, right? Like as I mentioned, we held the police budgetary increase to a 0.4% raise, which was significantly less than they were asking for, and that was because community members stepped into the breach, and not meaning to be kind of comical by saying that, but they stepped up and they suggested, hey, this is not what we want for our space. This is not what we want for our community. And that meeting only happened because Commissioner Critchley essentially filibustered the police board for hours until they relented and facilitated a public consultation. Now, it doesn't mean that there isn't the kind of classic backlash. So this year, for example, what they're doing is instead of an online meeting where people will be able to access this space and be able to speak to the police board as they did last year, they decided to make this space only in person, in a location that, you know, isn't necessarily accessible for everyone on January 16th in the evening, but you have to sign up by 2 p.m. There's a series of administrative workarounds and burdens to make sure that, hey, it's not quite as contentious as last year, right? And the purpose of this kind of process and the purpose of these burdens and these barriers is to make us tired, is to make us frustrated, is to make us bored so that we accept our lot, we punch down upon people that have less than us in the process, and we allow the interests of capital to roll all over us. And that's why we have to show up to these places, even though we know that oftentimes it's futile, to make sure that they recognize, hey, it's not as simple as you make it.
Thank you, Tari. And there are some questions in the chat about, is there organized resistance? Yes, people should sign up. Tari, do you have that information for people to sign up to speak at the police board? I'll point out it's also MLK Day. That's when all the MLK events are going on. So that knocks out a lot of Black people. How convenient. But yes, so people should sign up to present on the budget. I believe you get about 5 minutes. And I think showing that force at least shows that there is resistance in the community. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in around questions of challenging the budget, things that have been successful. HAFSA, New Brunswick has been doing cross-province organizing, not just municipal. And you spoke a bit about the town hall. So I don't know if you want to maybe jump in here. We had some questions in the chat, particularly about rural regions organizing against the police as well. So outside of the big city.
Yeah. So in terms of, and this fits into our next steps, abolitionists in New Brunswick are building an abolition coalition for the Atlantic region in order to create more education and awareness for the general public on what abolition is and why it is better for our societies and environments, as well as to help support each other. And so that this labor, it is thankless and it is labor intensive, so that we can rely on each other and provide respite. We're exploring how to do this in a technocratic Euro-American scientific language, but framed within an anti-colonial, decolonial, anti-capitalist framework. Our next steps are very much concerned about the colonization of abolition. We think that is the key. Elle presented this realization to many of us with her tweet saying, we're going to need to start having conversations about what it means when abolition becomes an industry. When abolition becomes an industry and the police budgets balloon, earnest activists may be deterred and opportunists may be lured. And I think we need to have that in mind as the movement continues to grow at an exponential rate. Specifically, there's an internal and external component of our movements. The inner workings of it are challenged by internalized colonialism, internalized capitalism, racism, misogyny, and transphobia. The external component of the movement involves going up against the state to resist their expansion of settler colonialism and its violence. We must always be cognizant of how the internal and external shape each other. In my opinion, rooting our defund movements in decolonization is the key. Decolonizing the internal components of the movement is decolonizing the mind of abolition. And decolonizing the external movement is ensuring it is always rooted in land back. If we maintain that defunding the police is a serious step in repatriation of the land, in dismantling settler colonialism, then it will simultaneously address the harms we perpetuate in our organizing and in our interpersonal relationships as activists and as community. Ordinary citizens are also serious about decolonization and are rejecting the, as Dr. Tuck calls it, metaphor of decolonization appropriated by colonial institutions. A decolonial approach to the defund movement presents an opportunity for settlers to pursue material decolonization, where the first step in our movement is usually the last step of metaphorical decolonization. That is, decolonizing the mind is considered the final objective, not the first step to material decolonization. Defunding the police through a decolonial approach is both a remedy for the colonization of our internal movements and a tangible first step towards dismantling settler colonialism.
Yeah, so sorry, I was trying to get off mute. I do also want to just read something that Desmond said, and feel free everyone to jump in. I don't need to prompt you, just jump in on things that are on your mind. But Desmond said that he wanted to add that in December, vigilant people in Toronto were able to stop an effort to revive the school resource officer program at the Toronto District School Board. Recent violence in our schools prompted this conversation, but many mobilized against the idea and deterred school trustees from bringing motions to restore SROs. This is a small victory built on hard work from over a decade ago that deserves to be acknowledged. Of all our efforts across Canada in recent years, campaigns to get cops out of schools have been quite successful, and there may be lessons there about how people organize in such local contexts as school boards. So thank you, Desmond, for that. And that also reminds us of the importance of youth organizing as well, because of course, much of that organizing took place by high school students. So making sure also that we're educating and making sure that youth are open, getting into these spaces, because we know that the energy and knowledge they bring is really important. So I don't know if the rest of you want to jump in. Is there anything we want to talk about on strategizing? Go ahead, Meenakshi. I see you moving.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of reflect on what happened in Vancouver when the police budget was in 2021. And I think Ted ended up writing about that, but there was a lot of advocacy after the George Floyd uprisings, in response to the police murders of both Regis and Chantal Moore, and Nuchanov woman, you know, whose family is from territories in so-called BC. And what was interesting is like the budget freeze happened, and then we saw the province intervene, and our provincial director of police services, so an unelected deputy minister within the provincial bureaucracy, overturned that budget freeze, restored, I think it was 5.7 million to the VPD. And so again, this is all within so-called progressive government. This is under the BC NDP's rule. And I don't necessarily bring that up to be like totally cynical, but I think it's also a reminder that like the work to defund the police is about land defense. It is about Indigenous sovereignty, about rematriation of land, as Huss has described. And we can attack it in a lot of different fronts. And I would be remiss in not mentioning SERG, which is an RCMP special unit that's been deployed against Indigenous land defenders on the Wet'suwet'en Yintah, on Secwepemc territory, and on Nuchanal territory as well. And I just like constantly need to trash talk the NDP, because I know that folks are like living under like much more right-wing governments. And then when you see what happens under this progressive government, where they allow budgets to rise, where the premier promises the RCMP they'll be fully funded, it's again a reminder that we have to get out of just the urban centers, that abolition is absolutely decolonial, and it means working in solidarity with land defenders across unceded lands. It means supporting frontline grassroots struggles of MMIW folks who are like doing their own searches, who are calling the police to account. And I think that that's a way that like abolitionists can also challenge like this industry that's absolutely going to pop up, and maybe already is.
Thank you. I'm also, you know what, I'm making an executive change. I'm going to also integrate the Q&A into this section, and then we'll try and be done in about 10 minutes if that works for everybody. So this is a good question. So I'm just changing our process a bit, but people can continue to talk. But it's also a good question, I think, is part of this around police unions. As is said here, a massive problem. Many people have sort of mentioned this already. How do we fight police unions and get them out of organized labor? I don't know if anyone wants to talk about that as we continue this discussion, but feel free, everyone, jump in. Don't wait for me. Like, I don't know if there's other things you haven't talked about, lessons you want to share, things that worked for you in your city, things that haven't worked. Like, let's not waste time on that. Jump in. Ted, I guess I'll gesture at you. So.
Sure. So I think there's a bunch of aspects to that question, and I can only address part of it, but I think it's really important. I mean, one of the ways that the police brotherhood in Montreal has a huge amount of power is just they have a public relations machine, as does the police. And they're really looped into the media. And so one of the things I wanted to throw out is that I think that the Defund the Police movement won the battle of ideas, won the public debate in 2020, but that was temporary, and it was always going to be temporary because we're all organizing in our spare time, and the police brotherhood, and other kinds of wealthy institutions like have full-time, huge public relations arms. And so one of the things that I'm interested in thinking about is, does that mean that we abandon trying to occupy the public debate entirely? Or do we try to occupy it very intensely during specific periods in time? And I'm kind of impressed with what they're doing in Toronto with a whole month of actions. And so they're going to be very much in the public debate for a month. And probably everyone will be burned out and they won't be able to continue it in in February. But maybe that's fine. And maybe that's a thing that we can do. And maybe that's a way to battle the police brotherhoods in terms of public relations. And the other thing I want to throw out there is how we relate to elected officials, because unfortunately they're the people who can make these decisions around budgets. And we think about this a lot in Montreal because we have this terrible political party that occupies the whole center left of the political spectrum. But I think there's some questions there. Like, obviously we don't want to spend our time like having closed door meetings with elected officials. I think it is really useful to engage in electoral politics around election time and trying to get defund candidates elected. And we did that in Montreal. We had 3 alternative political parties. We really helped shape their platforms. They all lost, but I think it was time well spent. And then I wonder also about, like, I don't think we should be spending our time having meetings with politicians, but if we have defund candidates in office, can we help them to organize among their peers? Like Tari said, like, we have the expertise, like a lot, you know, or like Ruth Wilson Gilmore said, that abolitionists are nerds. So we know this stuff. Politicians necessarily, you know, they don't have, they're not, I don't think they are nerds, you know? So I wonder if we can sort of outfit the pro-defund candidates in city council to organize among their peers so that we don't have to do it, because that's not the best work for us to be doing.
Thank you, Ted. I don't know if Leon, you leaned in, which means that you get to talk.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know if I have a direct point related to that.
No, on anything.
Just so many. Absolutely. Well, there's just so many things that have come up, and just you're talking about school resource officers, and of course the incident last month in Winnipeg was that a police dog on the canine unit was in one of our public schools and bit a child of color in one of our schools. And the Internal Investigations Unit was running a review on that, and they determined that it was not a serious enough incident for it to actually matter and go through a review. And, you know, this is just raises so many questions about, you know, beyond like school resource officers. It's what propaganda is happening in our schools in the first place to do presentations. Another tweet that was, you know, posted today was the River East Transcona School Division inviting cops from the Guns and Gangs units to do a presentation to middle schoolers. So it's really like inviting a lot of questions. It is inviting a lot of questions about the how we are organizing against one issue, which is the school resource officers, and brings to light a more expansive analysis of what we need to organize against in the context of schools. But, you know, in Winnipeg as well, all public spaces, the Millennium Library is under extreme security measures now because unfortunately there was a stabbing in early December, and it led to the temporary closure of the Millennium Library, which is the downtown library. And previously, the library had been highly securitized, like an airport-style entrance, where you have bag checks, you have metal detectors, and you're lined up and to exit and enter the building. Those measures were highly criticized from the group Millennium for All, and eventually they were revoked. And now, again, after this violent incident that just happened, which of course is a tragedy, it is not going to be resolved through the re-institutionalization of these intense security measures that actually just lead into less library use. In the year that followed the introduction of the security measures in 2019, the library usage went significantly down. And so we're going to be seeing this again as the library is on this staggered opening schedule right now. But again, it is coming up for public discussion of how we are increasing security in all of our public institutions, but also private institutions like thrift shops here, pharmacies, grocery stores. It is just policing, and the expansion of carcerality is happening in our city, which I'm sure others in the chat and, you know, on the panel here can probably relate to.
And I think one thing that's important there is police will always use these public tragedies, and then there's a kind of discourse that we're being uncivilized or uncivil if we then so-called politicize the situation. So I was actually in Winnipeg over Christmas, so I was reading the Free Press about, you know, Millennium Library, and then you're somehow seen as manipulating the situation to your own ends if you then say, well, this is why we need defunding. So we can't be afraid of intervening in these conversations, because we know that when these outlier events occur, because they are outliers, whether it's a child getting shot in school and then we get SROs, or a stabbing happens at the library, so now we need to change the library space. So we also have to be unafraid, I think, in entering into public discourse, that we have to constantly keep pushing, you know, constantly, whether that's editorials, whether that's public meetings, whether that's protests. On their own, yeah, like each protest may not make a difference, but having that kind of public presence, because the police will always take advantage of a crisis to install policing. And I know I don't want to talk too much, but I think we'd be remiss in saying that there also is a crisis in policing taking place. And I think we need to realize that some of this backlash is the push of an institution that is on the hook. In Nova Scotia, we had the MCC, the Mass Casualty Commission. And this is like average people that aren't defunding people, that are extremely angry at the RCMP because of how they completely disgustingly dropped the ball in all their communication, their inability. The one thing that's supposed to be there to identify and fight mass shooting, they couldn't do that. The treatment of the families has been absolutely awful by the province and the police. And we've seen this whole push. So the MCC really created a space where ordinary people politicized around the police. Ottawa is another situation where we have another inquiry taking place, and we were revealed how much the Ottawa police were colluding with the convoy. So these are also moments for us to continue to intervene. Desmond Cole has called this the white crisis in policing that's taking place, where this discourse is shifting from Indigenous, racialized Black people, sex workers, etc., to the more mainstream. So we also know that as much as we're in some despair around the thin blue line patches being worn by ex-cop counselors and the cop mayor and, you know, the increased technology, all these things that are happening, we have to remember they're also happening because we are being successful in the way that we're speaking. So I'll just say that. I don't want to take too long. We have about 5 more minutes. Is there anything from the chat? So we have some conversations around communication. Sorry, I have to lean forward, guys. So now my head's going to be weird in the screen. We can cut this later. I think that's important. There's a lot of comments in the chat kind of connecting other ideas to carcerality. So, for example, the backlash on trans people and drag story hour in particular that's taking place, sex ed and stuff being cut from school. So I think there's a kind of commentary going on in the chat around the importance of connecting these issues to other struggles and recognizing how they're connected. So the same people that like support increased policing are also outside drag queen story hour screaming groomer at trans and queer people, right? So just recognizing how these struggles are connected and coming into solidarity on them. And I think that's a really important thing in the chat. We do have some comments on militarization. I don't know if anybody wants to quickly address that.
Well, I didn't want to address militarization, but I did want to return back to something that's been kind of coming up again and again and again. And it's this idea of this full court PR press that police organizations, whether it's unions, whether it's the chiefs of police, that they're undertaking in real time, and they're doing it because they're scared. They're doing it because they're petrified. As Elle was saying, there is a crisis in policing right now. And I think that despite the fact that, yes, these budgets are going up, we are seeing people from places and spaces that we would have never imagined begin to question the taken for granted assumptions about policing as an inherent good in our society. And one of the ways that we have evidence of this is the fact that, for example, Chief Dan Kinsella in Halifax noted that it's negative public sentiment towards police that's taking a toll on officers that is, in fact, one of the justifications for the police increase. Last year, they mentioned that it was increased hostility from protesters, right? In other words, apparently we're funding the police while we're contesting them in an incredibly ironic twist of fate. But what this really indicates is that, actually, they are petrified. And so they are doubling down and they are rooting themselves as fervently and as aggressively as they possibly can. And part of the reason why we can see that is because they're not as good at it as they used to be. These are not taken for granted assumptions anymore. And so that's something that's really important for us to recognize as we are pushing for change, right? Like the things that were only ever either whispered about or only spoken about in activist circles or never really accepted are now things that are part of our common discourse, and that's something that's really important.
Go ahead, Hafsa. I know you had something you wanted to say.
Sure. I just joke about how we should name our abolitionist movement MAGA, make abolition great again, because the population that's drawn to MAGA is accurately identifying that there's something really wrong with the political economy, but they don't have the privilege to study it because they're being crushed by it, and their settler privilege didn't prepare them for that kind of oppression. So if we name our movement MAGA, make abolition great again, perhaps they will accidentally be allured to dismantling capitalism without the culture war internalization that motivate their aversion to working with us, and help them realize that abolition is what they were looking for all along.
Thanks, Hafsa. And I will say that Grassroots New Brunswick has been doing a lot of work, like really just starting at the beginning, like doing education in communities, holding town halls, so we can do this, continue to do this basic work. I'm mindful of the time. I know we said we'd end 20 minutes ago. So why don't we do just kind of last call. So if people want to make a very short last comment to take us away, and perhaps one thing in particular that you think, like one message of hope or like encouragement or action that people can take forward. Thank you to everybody in the chat. We will be preserving the chat. There was great commentary. Thank you for being here and speaking along with us and sharing. And we do what we wanted to do. The reason why we wanted to do this conversation wasn't to position ourselves as authorities in any way. It was because we are at the beginning of the year. It's going to be a long year. And we really wanted to motivate ourselves and each other and people across this so-called country to continue to push back, to fight, and to create networks where we're sharing knowledge and organizing together. So we encourage you offline to continue to get in touch with each other, to get in touch with us, and we can all keep pushing. So final notes from people. I'm going to just go left to right across my screen, which means Hafsa, Ted, Tari is the first set.
Don't give up, because I really believe we're winning. Join an organization of any sort and continue working. Thank you.
Ted, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that maybe we sort of got tricked into believing in 2020 that we could really change things radically, really quickly. And what we're finding out is, no, it's like, this is a long-term struggle. And if we're talking about abolition, this is going to take our lifetimes. And I think that that's helpful to recognize, and it's a great movement to be part of. And I think that we should just keep doing this work. It has to happen. And so it will at some point. And if you're in the Montreal area, check out @Defund la Police on social media and see if you can if you want to get involved, get in touch.
Tari.
In a similar vein, a encouragement not to give up, a recognition that capital is incredibly scared and that we have to keep fighting. Yes, the horizon, the timelines are our lifetime and a lot longer, but that doesn't mean that it's not worth doing.
Thank you, Tari. Leon?
I just like to shout out to the grassroots activism as the space that is actually going to lead to freedom. And whenever I have the opportunity to speak with or on behalf of WPCH as a member, I always try to shout out to the other grassroots organizations that are working in tandem to do things that are, even if they don't call themselves abolitionist, are abolitionist in spirit, whether it's based on Indigenous resurgence, whether it's based on community forms of safety, and they are not operating under the name. We are creating situations locally, local practices of abolitionist dismantling, but also world making. And we have that power in these local settings. And we just have to think of how those local grassroots organizations can work collaboratively and can work and have their collective power united. So I think that that's all I have to mention. Thanks.
Thank you. And finally, Meenakshi.
You can do anything. It can be small. All you need is some Zap straps, a banner, and paint from the dollar store, and that is enough to piss a cop off. Make a banner, do mutual aid drops. There's, endless things we can do, because policing as a system is so fucking fragile that literally a banner up at a abandoned Value Village lot is enough to threaten them. So don't feel despair. Like, really, they are so threatened by us, and I think it's so powerful when you look at their budgets, right? 300, like in the orders of like $300 million, and like a dollar store paint on a piece of, like, on an old sheet pisses them off tremendously. And I saw like a note in the chat, folks in Ottawa shifted towards mutual aid. Mutual aid is abolition. Don't let nonprofits co-opt it. And if you're listening and you're in a position where you have some kind of like stability, you have like a salary job, a union job, you have like a nonprofit gig, you're a prof, like think about how you can support infrastructure if you can't be on the front line. So what can you do? Not just in money, but in other ways of like supporting organizing. And my last thing is like, we do have wins, and a big win that I saw last year was with Justice for Jared, when, you know, our civilian oversight agency, half staffed by cops, did make a determination that the Wet'suwet'en man, Jared Lowndes, was murdered by the police. The BC Prosecution Service is considering whether or not it will lay charges against up to 4 RCMP officers from Campbell River. And that is absolutely a product of his mother, Laura Holland's tireless work.
Thank you, Meenakshi. And thank you, everybody. We are at the end of time. If you did enjoy this discussion, this, of course, only touched on things. Let the Breach know. We can come back and maybe do some of these monthly if people enjoyed them. I'm putting the Breach on the spot. Thank you so much to the Breach. This was made possible in very quick manner by all the technical hosting behind the scenes, all the organizing. Desmond and I were talking, we're like, we should do this. And it really just came together in a couple of weeks. Thank you to everybody who spoke. Thank you for everybody in the chat. And again, I encourage you to continue sharing knowledge, to find whatever way that is, because when we educate ourselves on these issues, we don't have to remake the wheel, right? Something that's happening in Vancouver will be happening in Halifax, will be happening in Moncton. So it's important that we continue to share our strategy so that we're not constantly starting from nothing. On that note, I want to thank everybody. So thank you to the Breach. Thank you to Ted, Meenakshi, Tari. Oh God, I started naming people now. I have to do everyone. Leon, Desmond, who has left, Hafsa. Did I get everybody? Hopefully I got everybody. Thank you to everybody in the chat. I'm Elle Jones. Thank you so much. And that is it. So we hope that we see you out at board meetings, council meetings, protests, whatever it is. Somebody said in the chat, and it's a good place to end, that hope is a discipline. That means in order to have hope, we have to work in the present to create the conditions that keep us looking forward into the future. We have that power and that capacity. So thank you, everybody, and have a good night.